Hey, girl. Hey, you crazy dog.
There's my favorite girl.
After the first session that I spent with The Last of Us 2, I'd probably played for about 6 or so hours, and I felt miserable, depressed, and emotionally exhausted. As I finally decided it was time to take a break and go out and get some sunshine or watch videos of puppies online to cheer myself up, the title card came up for the next chapter, Day 2.
Oh my god.
The first few hours of The Last of Us 2 is the most miserable, mentally draining game I think I've ever played. And I really don't think I'm exaggerating by saying that.
Oh, it's okay. I totally get it. I felt bad.
The beginning of this campaign throws so much shocking events at you, it's kind of hard to imagine how it could even get worse from this point on. Don't worry though, it kinda does, and I'm going to talk about some of it. Hopefully the mob has dispersed enough now too, so we can actually talk about this thing properly.
Why would they do that?
Should be said too that if you haven't finished the game at this point, well, there's going to be a few minor spoilers in the video. Don't say I didn't warn you.
You hear yourself?
The creative director of this game allegedly said that they didn't use the word fun when trying to design it, and after having finally finished it, I can see why. You know, some games have warnings about flashing lights for people who have epilepsy, or with some VR games you get a motion sickness warning. Well, honestly, I think they need to include one here for those people who have anxiety and depression, because you're not going to leave this thing feeling all that comfortable at the end of it. Apparently this game set some kind of record for the amount of returns made in its first week, and yeah, I can understand why. I have no intention or desire to ever replay any of this, and I imagine I'm not the only one who shares that sentiment. It'd be like getting into a car crash, then downloading the dashcam footage and just re-watching it over and over again.
Look out!
It's probably no surprise anymore, and the leaks have been over the internet more than photos of Kim Kardashian's ass, but the key events that set this game in motion involve some pretty rough sequences that are a bit of a slap in the face to the fans of the original game. Or is that a golf club in the face?
Ow! What the fuck?
What we've got here is a story that probably never needed to be told in the first place, making us spend several hours playing as returning protagonist Ellie. Then at a time when you'd think the whole story would be naturally coming to an end, it then continues on again for another 10 or so hours.
That can't be.
Introducing an entirely new character with Abby.
I gotta see it through.
The basic premise is that it takes place after the ending of the first game. After Joel rescues Ellie from the Fireflies, they've gone into hiding somewhere in Jackson, Wyoming. She hasn't quite forgiven him though for what he's done, and there's a bit of a rift between them, you know, as you'd expect.
You alright, kiddo?
What is wrong with you?
They're both living on a settlement with Joel's brother Tommy, just trying to make ends meet. Ellie's got this kind of a love triangle going on with a guy named Jesse and a girl named Dina, and if only that'd be the worst thing she'd have to worry about. But revenge comes in the form of Abby and the Washington Liberation Front, who are a bunch of guys who've scoured the country trying to find Joel for revenge after what he did to the Fireflies. It's kind of hard to talk about what happens next without directly spoiling the game, so look, if on the off chance that you don't know what happens next, well then skip ahead to this timecode here. In fact, maybe just don't watch the video at all. But I'll just say that the catalyst for the story is Joel being murdered. In fact, not even murdered, executed by Abby and the WLF in a cinematic that is just downright traumatizing to watch. Why are they doing this? Well, because it turns out that doctor in the first game from the ending, who was a literal NPC, was actually the Tony Stark of the apocalypse, and the only guy who could have created a vaccine.
That can't be.
So Abby spent the last 4 years getting shredded and trying to track Joel down to arm wrestle him over what happened. Now first off, I don't consider this good writing. In fact, it's actually bad writing because it's the most predictable outcome based off what he did in the first game. Anyway, after that, Ellie then heads off for revenge with her new gal pal Dina, with Tommy a couple of days ahead of them.
Here we go.
This takes place primarily in Seattle as they track Abby and her buddies down in a campaign that just seems to go on and on. Seriously, just when you think the whole thing is gonna come to an end, another chapter begins and then you're off for another 2 or 3 hours. And then in probably the biggest shock, once you've spent 10 or so hours playing through the whole thing as Ellie, and the story reaches its crucial moment, it then cuts to black, goes 3 days back, and you're replaying it all from Abby's perspective. That'd be like if in Empire Strikes Back, just as Vader tells Luke that he's his father, oh sorry, spoilers, Luke looks off the edge, he's about to drop off, but then it cuts back to the attack on Hoth, and we follow the journey back to Bespin from Vader's perspective. This is something that was apparently under pretty heavy embargo when the game launched, which makes it even weirder that they try to hide half of a game from consumers. Kinda reminds me a lot of the Raiden reveal in Metal Gear Solid 2. The only difference was that I didn't go on to hate Solid Snake with a burning passion by the end of that game. From this point on, you've got an entirely new cast of characters, Abby included, and it explores the relationship between all of these people, alongside a new enemy faction, the Seraphites, and I've gotta be honest, I found this stuff way more interesting than Ellie's story. In fact, I actually preferred it.
Really?
And can I just say that amongst all of the bitching about Abby looking like she's competing in the Miss Olympia contest, I gotta say, I don't think that's at all unrealistic. I mean, in a world where you're fighting for survival and your fitness can literally mean life or death, it makes the most sense to be in that kind of shape, especially for a woman. So you know what, she can crush my head like a watermelon with those thighs of hers any day.
Really?
It also kind of brings up the question though of who the hell are we supposed to be rooting for here? Tell you one thing, for me, sure as hell wasn't Ellie. You could spend an entire video breaking down the problems this game has simply from a narrative perspective until your tongue goes dry. But I think it's just down to poor pacing with such an odd shift between those faster paced, intense set pieces and then the slower character building moments where it just has this constant feeling of moving ahead aimlessly. And this isn't an insult to the actors in this thing either. These guys do a really good job with what they're given. Laura Bailey does a great job as Abby and no one deserves getting death threats for work they've done on a fictional character. Troy Baker's once again and comes across as effortless as always, and to be honest, I'm starting to think this guy's got some kind of a clause in his contracts that allows him to play a guitar in every single game he's in. We get it, Troy, you can play the guitar.
What is wrong with you?
And I won't lie too, a couple of moments kinda got me choked up a bit, but a perfect story this one ain't, and character assassination, same-sex relationships, and shocking and violent scenes just for the sake of being shocking and violent doesn't really equate to good writing. The shift in the tone though between Abby and Ellie's campaign though is massive to the point that it almost feels like you're playing two separate games, which, I mean, you really kind of are. One of the first things I noticed when playing this though, aside from just how depressed it made me feel, was just how fucking amazing it looks. This would have to be one of the best looking games to come out on the PlayStation 4, if not honestly just one of the best looking games ever. And if this is going to be one of the swan songs for the console before the PlayStation 5 hits, well, at least it's sure going out with a bang. The amount of detail you can see on the character models is crazy. Being able to pick out individual follicles of hair on someone's beard, the pigments on their skin, or the freckles on their ass cheeks.
Shit.
You really forget you're playing a game at times because of how believable the cinematography and the motion capture is.
What? Just turn around. What are you doing?
Kidding me.
Even though most of the environments are just dilapidated city streets covered in wrecked cars and patches of grass, it still does a good job of mixing this up with different times of day and different weather, so it doesn't feel too similar. It starts to go beyond real and just becomes hyper-real, dive bombing into some serious uncanny valley territory, which all comes to a peak with what is one of the most awkward sex scenes in any video game. This is all a good thing though, considering the majority of this game feels more like you're watching a film, so yeah, get comfortable. I think the point when I started to get the idea that Naughty Dog were more concerned with advancing the story over the gameplay was when I realised that there's not even any kind of achievement for beating this thing on the higher difficulty modes, whereas the last game had achievements for every single one. The Last of Us 2 is a challenging game. I mean, on hard mode, you're constantly searching for ammo and supplies, and the enemy AI is pretty clever, spotting you easily and doing a good job at just being a complete nuisance. The only difference I could see between normal and hard mode, which is what I played on, was the amount of resources you come across. Still, it'd be a hell of a lot easier with a mouse and a keyboard though, but PC ports seem to elude every single Naughty Dog game. I guess they just hate money. On top of that, you've got these combat accessibility options where you can tweak countless factors from whether or not your weapon sways when aiming, even down to becoming entirely invisible to enemies when going prone. And it just kind of feels like they're tailoring the game towards the people who don't really want any kind of challenge from the experience, and are just seeking little more than an interactive film. And that might be fine, but the thing is that the gameplay just hasn't really been all that improved since the first game. And where it has been changed or modified is only really in regards to new mechanics. The way it feels is still the same, if that makes sense. Shooting is serviceable, but that's about as far as I'd go with it. Kind of works in the sense that you aim at someone and press the fire button, and then the bullet's gonna hit them. Headshots are usually an instant kill, and body shots are gonna drop someone in maybe 2 or 3 shots. Weapons can be upgraded from those generic weapon parts scattered throughout each chapter. And you collect pills, pills, to upgrade your character, with both Ellie and Abby having unique trees. Combat though is still loud and gruesome. You can remove someone's head or limb if they're shot with a high-powered weapon like the rifle or the shotgun. And enemies scream in considerable pain when they're killed. This game makes no illusions during combat that you are killing human beings. Having someone scream super loudly or hearing another enemy lament a death by referring to that person by their first name, I mean look, it's a neat touch, but doesn't really make me feel bad either way. It might if they were innocent people, but pretty much every single combat situation you find yourself in boils down to self-defense, so it's a non-issue. There's always been a good balance here, I think, between finding just enough ammo and resources to get by, but still having it limited to the extent that you can't really afford to go into every single gunfight like John Wick. I think one of the best parts about the shooting is the sound work. That loud crack you get from the rifle, or that meaty thwack and cracking of the bone when you hit someone in the chest with an axe, really plays a big part, I think, in how impactful it all feels. Considering otherwise though, it really just feels and plays like the first game, a 2013 game with 2020 visuals. In a lot of ways, it's almost identical, just with slightly better animations and physics, though even then, some of the animations can still be super wonky. Some of the new inclusions to the gameplay is that you can now go fully prone and become harder to detect when you're moving through these patches of thick grass. Because yeah, the whole notion of being able to stealth in thick grass is something we've never seen in a video game before. That was sarcasm, by the way. Probably the biggest addition though are the attack dogs in certain areas, because they really want to make you feel even more like a miserable piece of shit when playing this game. And these things will sniff you out by following your scent, like a dried up cougar sniffs out cologne in a nightclub at 2 AM. I did have an issue with these things until I realised you can just shoot the person holding the dog's leash and then the dog just kind of walks around in circles. I mean, it's a more desirable outcome than having to shoot it in the face or having one of them bite your whole goddamn head off. I've seen it, it's not pretty. They then try to make you feel bad for killing some of these, assuming you did in Abby's story.
Get the ball.
But still, not exactly working, because again, self-defense. Look, I'd kill a goddamn hamster and not feel bad about it for a second if it was trying to kill me. And believe me, hamsters can be vicious bastards. Anyway, depending on who you're playing as is also going to change the weapons you're using. Ellie basically has the same weapons from the first game, but Abby has her own unique set. Compared to Ellie's shotgun, Abby instead has a double-barreled version, which can also fire incendiary rounds. Her rifle is a faster firing automatic rifle that can be upgraded to fire in burst mode. She still has an automatic pistol, but now instead of the revolver, she's got a hunting pistol, which does insane damage. She also gets a crossbow instead of the bow, turning you into a buffed up gender swap of Daryl from The Walking Dead. And then near the end of her story, you'll also get the flamethrower. The only thing that doesn't make sense to me is that she still has to craft shivs. Despite there being a well-stocked armory at the base she's stationed at, she never once thought to take along an axe or a hammer or, I don't know, some kind of sturdy metal pipe. And this is kind of annoying because you can't attack the clickers without one. If only all of those push-ups and bicep curls had have helped her take these things head on. And you've also got Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs, traps to place down and medkits. For both characters, when you're in melee combat, you can perform a dodge move to avoid taking a hit. Again, a dodge move. Where do they come up with these wonderful ideas? Melee weapons also make a return, and again, for some reason, these break within a few hits. I guess the future these guys live in is one where a machete shatters to pieces after you hit someone with it 5 or 6 times. But on the plus side, you can now repair these weapons if you've got the resources, giving it increased damage and durability. Not that it really improves it though, because the melee combat is still really janky. Wait until you get into the fight with Miss Trunchbull from Matilda and you'll see what I mean.
I like a joke as well as the next fat person.
And nothing screams diversity more than killing a big fat woman with a pickaxe. Most importantly is that you can now jump. Again, jumping. What a feature. It's almost like in some way Naughty Dog have kind of done this homage to their platforming roots with Crash Bandicoot. If Ellie or Abby started going around collecting voodoo masks and eating peaches, well then it would have really come full circle. What have I got? The other thing they've added in is the ability to climb up ropes, and again, it's not exactly earth-shattering, but at least it does offer up some kind of variety to the exploration. And I gotta say that I'm genuinely impressed by the physics. I imagine some poor animator spending hours trying to make this thing look believable. Like the first game, you're either having to deal with humans or clickers. Humans are still pretty much the same, aside from Miss Trunchbull and her boyfriends, who seem to shrug off a shotgun to the face like it's a slap on the ass. Clickers still behave the same as before though, with varying stages of infection. One of the new clickers includes the Shambler, no, not that Shambler, which is another more advanced infection stage with the ability to shoot out this burst of acid in all directions when you get too close, kind of like upsetting a Sony fanboy on Twitter. Then you've got the Stalkers, get out of here Stalker, which hide behind cover and wait for you to get close before they ambush you. Kind of like the Stalkers from Dead Space 2. Yeah, it's almost literally the same enemy. And then you'll have some tense fights against a couple of bloaters as well, which is always good at puckering up that arsehole tight enough to turn a lump of coal into diamond.
Got you, asshole!
Either way though, you've got the option to try to stealth or shoot your way through most encounters. Though, calling this thing a stealth game is kind of an insult to stealth games. And I still can't really understand how there's a AAA title released in 2020 with a massive focus on this approach that also happens to have some of the most bare bones mechanics needed to get by. Right, so the way it works is that you spend most of the time crouched or prone to avoid getting seen. When you are being seen or detected, you get a whooshing sound that gets louder and louder. If you're prone in grass, you're pretty much invisible to enemies unless they're standing right on top of you. Doesn't seem to matter if you're in the light or the dark, there's no consideration to the kind of surface you're on, and even if you spend all the time being methodical and taking out all of these bad guys without being seen, you can't even move their bodies around. So sooner or later someone's going to come across one of them and enemies are going to start to search for you. You can use your listen mode to see where bad guys are coming from, but once you take your finger off that button, you've still got to scan the environment manually. And for a game that looks almost photorealistic, trying to see where an enemy is spotting you from with such vivid and complex visuals is easier said than done sometimes. I'm almost convinced that there's areas in this game that you can't get through without at the very least the enemy becoming aware of your presence and searching for you. I couldn't get past any of those areas with the dogs either without at least taking out the guy holding the dog's leash. This game ain't exactly spreading the message of being a pacifist, so no shocks there. When I really started to enjoy playing The Last of Us 2 was just when I approached it as a shooter that also happened to have stealth kills. I'd head into an area and do my best to take out a couple of guys without being seen, but then I'd just go loud and waste the rest of them. Abby's story, I think, definitely has some of the better combat areas too. These are ones that feel more like mini arenas, where you can break line of sight and flank around behind enemies, or just lie prone in the grass and wait for someone to walk by, giving you complete autonomy in taking all of these enemies out, or not taking them out. Ellie's environments, on the other hand, to me just felt much more limited. Trying to play it as an outright stealth game, it just doesn't feel developed enough to be reliable, and trying to approach it as a straight shooter isn't possible because of the limited resources. So I think finding that middle ground that allows for a combination of both styles is where the game works the best. Kind of comes back to what I said before though, how there really is just such a low focus on improving the gameplay this time, and without a doubt it forms the lowest possible component of the amount of time you spend with the game. For the first couple of hours or so, which is all a prologue, I probably spent a grand total of 15 or so minutes in actual gameplay. Now, when I say gameplay, I mean playing the game with the possibility of there being a fail state where I could be killed by something. I don't count it as gameplay when I'm walking around and listening to someone talk, or riding a horse and listening to someone talk. There's no skill in that.
Look who's talking.
You could stick a rubber band to the controller and achieve the same result. It's little more than interactive dialogue. But truth be told, the gameplay in this has been blown out of proportion in a negative way, and still, despite how little it seems to have been improved, it's a perfectly functioning third-person shooter with stealth elements. It's the story though, where it all jumps on the express elevator to hell, going down. For starters, the story's length is a pretty big turnoff. I mean, this thing just goes on, and then on some more. When the story feels like it's coming to an end, you've really only made it halfway. Then you have to play through the entire 3 days over again in Seattle from Abby's perspective. After that, it still has like 3 or 4 hours left in it. It's like some poor patient being kept on life support. Just someone pull the plug, please. Flashbacks with Ellie and Joel are interesting, but they're not really needed. All it really does is show us that Ellie and Joel have this uneasy pseudo-father-daughter relationship, and that there's some kind of awkwardness between them, but again, this isn't entirely new information.
Good.
On the other hand, playing as Abby, seeing her backstory and all these flashbacks at least makes more sense, because she's a new character, so we're gonna need to see some development on her part to understand her motives and relate to her. And I'm more likely to side with her anyway, considering the actions she took against Joel are completely justified. Even more so when Joel himself admits numerous times that he's a bad person who's done bad things. Sooner or later, some aspect of his past would have caught up with him. It's just a weird combination because despite the first half of the story focusing on Ellie, I really think that by the end of it, most people are going to see Abby in a better light.
Let's just make it quick.
The real takeaway I had from playing this was, is this a story that really needed to be told? I always kind of felt like the ending to the first game was bittersweet. We'd become so attached to both of these characters that the thought of losing either of them was a tough pill to swallow. But knowing what we knew about Joel and the loss he suffered with his daughter, his actions made sense. It didn't excuse them, but it did explain them. Ellie's actions in this ending, they make no sense. She leaves an ideal situation at some kind of last-ditch attempt at revenge, doesn't even go through with it, and then arguably ends up even worse off than she did after Joel died.
I don't care.
The ending of The Last of Us 2 didn't affect me in any kind of profound way, it just left me feeling empty, like I'd just eaten greasy takeaway food. I felt dirty inside. In a decade or so, people might come back to this thing with nostalgia goggles on and say it's some kind of underrated masterpiece that us gamers at the time just didn't get. I think the real problem with the game though was those leaks that ruined a lot of the key plot points before the game even came out, before people had a chance to experience the whole thing organically. People posting spoilers on social media and all that kind of stuff is nothing new, but a spoiler coming from within Naughty Dog is about the worst thing that could have happened. And yes, I know the backstory of why that all happened, I get it. It just really sucks though, because it means that even people who haven't played the game and experienced it think they've got an understanding of what happens in the grand scheme of the story, when there really is just so much more stuff that goes on here.
Was I talking?
There are elements of greatness in here, and there are moments when the gameplay truly shines, but is it really worth it for just how dreadful you're gonna feel for the majority of this experience? And at a time when the world is going to shit, I just don't think this is the kind of game we need.